rheumatology community. And as the panelists mentioned, the rheumatology community is very used to infused drugs because of their experience with TNF-alphas and the infused drugs that they use. So we're not reinventing the wheel from a process perspective. Obviously, this is going to be, if it's approved, the first drug in 50 years to treat this particular condition. But these rheumatologists are very used to RA and other conditions that they use infused drugs for. So we think that we're not reinventing the wheel from a process perspective. But nonetheless, that gives us a pretty good sense of how the growth is expected to go. Once you get out beyond the fourth quarter of launch and you get a J-code and the systems are all set up, we are very hopeful that Benlysta can grow very nicely. And
can you remind us how many rheumatologists have infusion capacity? How many rheumatologists out of how many in total?
Well, there are about 3,500 rheumatologists in the United States, of which 1,200 consider themselves lupus specialists. All of the rheumatologists either have their own infusion centers, or they have access to a hospital, or they have access to an off-site infusion center. So they're all used to doing that. And the way that the profitability of the drug from the physician's perspective works is that they typically make a margin on the drug itself, and they also get an infusion fee if they're infusing it themselves. So some of them will take that. Others will send it off to a clinic or an infusion center to do it that way. So the great thing about having 3,500 rheumatologists is that with a relatively limited sales force, you can cover all of them. So it's not like a small molecule primary care company where you have to really decile and go after the top prescribers. This is a case where we can really effectively cover all of the rheumatologists in the United States, and certainly all of the lupus specialists. And we have about
75,000 patients treated at rheumatologists today, and that's just in excess of the 200,000. It's not that far off. Have you considered what a prevalence-based pricing model would yield in terms of a price per year per patient for Benlysta?
Well, clearly, given the fact that we're 3 weeks away from the PDUFA date, and in the event that we get approved on the PDUFA date, where the launch is not going to be far behind it, we would be a fairly incompetent management team if we had not got into pricing discussions with GlaxoSmithKline and actually sort of figured out where it's going to be. So I think from a price perspective, there are two relevant comparators that we look at. One is the TNF-alphas, and those tend to be priced in the high teens to the low 20s. And the other is the multiple sclerosis drugs, which have a much wider band of pricing. It ranges from the low 30,000s to the high 40,000s. Those are sort of the comparators that we look at, that we have looked at in terms of coming up with price. While we obviously want to return as much money to our shareholders as we can, we also don't want to come up with a price that is so high that it presents a burden to the patient community, and it also results in step therapy from payers. So lupus is an unusual condition in that the typical presenting patient is a woman, often of color, in her late 20s, and she could be on Benlysta or another lupus drug for 30 years. They could be on the drug for a long time. The mortality associated with lupus is about 3 times that of the general population. So this is one where it's not like a cancer drug where you want to price it at $95,000 a year. It's one where you want to be mindful of your shareholders, but you also want to be mindful of the patient community that you're serving. And so we've obviously had discussions with GSK on the pricing, and I think we've agreed that those are the relevant comparators. And we would expect that the pricing is going to be fairly evident as we launch the product. The one thing I would say on pricing is that Benlysta will be administered on a weight-based dose. So it's the dose that we tested was 10 milligrams per kilogram of weight of the patient. So obviously a heavier patient is going to take more drug to get to 10 mg per kg. A lighter patient will take less. And since the drug is priced based on a vial, there will be some variability in the actual pricing to the patient.
There's been some confusion on Wall Street about the makeup of the lupus market and how many patients have which manifestations according to different severities of things like CNS and lupus nephritis. How do you see Benlysta's role in these areas, given that the need may be greater there? The drug has been studied in the severest ends of those spectrums, but you could see maybe some demand at least.
Well, I think the confusion comes from the patients that we haven't tested, and those exist on the low end and on the high end of severity. On the low end, we didn't test the milder patients. Those are patients that are likely not to want to come into a rheumatologist's office once a month or once every 2 weeks for an infusion. We are working on an auto-injector subcutaneous administration for those patients. On the high end, we didn't test patients that had lupus nephritis that was so severe that they were taking drugs like IV Cytoxan, the really powerful cytotoxics. Those patients need an acute therapy, and a maintenance therapy like Benlysta, it would be very hard to tell the signal of what Benlysta was doing when you're co-administering a drug that's as potent as IV Cytoxan. That is really very few patients. And in all likelihood, a patient would progress through lupus nephritis to require IV Cytoxan, and then they would improve. The purpose of that drug is to improve them, so they would then become candidates for Benlysta again. In the event that we're approved for the patient base that we tested, on the low end, we didn't test the very mild patients who are well served on their prednisone and their antimalarials. And on the severe end, we didn't test patients that were taking IV Cytoxan because we couldn't tell the benefit of Benlysta against that. Within that group of patients, we think that we tested a pretty representative sample of patients.
So could you just walk us through the accounting and reporting methodology with you and GSK? Who will report which aspects of the financials?
Well, I would imagine many of you may be saying, my God, this guy's the CFO and you've asked him to talk about accounting. So before you go to sleep, I will try to make it very simple. And it's not simple, we book all of the sales in the United States. GlaxoSmithKline books all of the sales in Europe, even though we share all of the costs worldwide. We book the gross margin in the U.S., they book the gross margin in Europe, and then we pay them 50% of the gross margin in the U.S., and they pay us 50% of the gross margin in Europe. Now, to the extent that our sales forces are misaligned, which in the U.S. we think they pretty much won't be, in Europe we're going to be selling in 3 countries.
Human Genome Sciences.